Well, hello, and it's a pleasure to see you. My name's Adrian Gilbert, if you haven't come across me before. I tend to write books on all sorts of esoteric matters, things about pyramids, Mayan calendars, biblical prophecy, all of that kind of thing, and also a lot of British history, King Arthur, Stone of Destiny. But today I'm going to be focusing on something a bit more, how can I put it, Eastern, but with a Western twist. Well, this lecture anyway is called Attack of the Dragons. Now, Mahjong is a game that's played widely in China and in Southeast Asia, but also now in the West, since I think the 1920s, became very popular then. And it comes in a little chest. You can see here, I hold it up, and inside this chest there are trays, and these trays, or the drawers, hold tiles. So it's actually rather fun, I have to say. It's a bit like playing the game. The game itself plays a bit like Rummy, if you've ever played that, a card game where you're collecting groups of 3 cards. You have to get a whole set within your hand by swapping cards and taking cards from other people and that sort of thing. It's a little bit like that, but we're not really going to be talking about the game itself. I'm interested in some of the symbolism that's implicit within the game. You won't find this written in textbooks, but there is a symbolism implicit in the way that Mahjong is structured. So here you can see the little chest, and there are the drawers out holding the tiles. Now the players take on the roles of 4 winds: north, south, east and west. And the game begins with building a big wall out of the tiles. Inside there, by the way, are these little sticks, or they're known as the bones of the ancestors. Now here you can see the Great Wall of China itself. As you know, the Chinese had a very advanced civilization, even at the time when the European civilization was really quite primitive. They had very sophisticated culture going. They had nice clothes made of silk. They invented paper to print on. They had gunpowder first. Now here you can see a map of China with the Great Wall, which stretches for thousands of miles, going right across the top of China, mainly to keep out the Mongols. But the symbolism of the wall, I'll go back to that one there. The symbolism is the idea of protecting a central space. That when you have a space with your civilization, your culture, you've got to defend it. You might have to defend it with a physical wall, or it might be rivers or the sea or mountains. There has to be some kind of sense of defining space. And it's really no different from myself out in our garden. We've got a fence between ourselves and our neighbours. Nothing wrong with our neighbours, nice people. I hope they feel the same about us. But we want to divide our space from their space, making it clear that what goes on in our side is our business, what goes on their side is their business. That's really what a wall is all about. And of course, America is just in the process of waking up to this reality with the proposed wall between the USA and Mexico, which Donald Trump is pushing forward very hard. These are the three dragons, which the Chinese call arrows. And I'm going to go through them one at a time. And what I'm going to be saying now is probably not what you're going to hear, read, or see in books on Mahjong. This is kind of implicit ideas connected with what these arrows or these dragons really symbolize. So we begin with the green dragon, and the simple meaning of that is prosperity and sincerity. So you would think that with the people who are studying for their exams in Mandarin China, they're being taught you must have sincerity to bring about prosperity. And that's one of the aims, the honours that you're aiming to get to prove that you have got. And then the second one, the red dragon, represents benevolence. And that symbol there actually represents the center point. I suppose that's an arrow sticking through it. And that's actually used, I believe, in the Unity of China symbol. But it's the idea is that you have to be able to stand in the center and be benevolent. If you're going to have an official role, then benevolence really means well-wishing. So you're wishing well for the people who are relying on you. You might be a local governor or something. You need to be benevolent, looking after the needs of the people. And the third one, they call this a whiteboard, which is why it's got nothing written on it. And it represents freedom from corruption and filial piety. Now, obviously, if you're going to be an official in the Chinese hierarchy, to be free from corruption is an ideal, what is wanted and required. I'm sure, like today, it very rarely actually comes over that way. China is famous for corruption, at least these days. But that's the ideal that they're aiming for. Filial piety, well, that means the whole idea of the family and the son respecting the father, and the father and respecting the grandfather, the understanding of the that you have to look after those who have greater wisdom, and you owe things to them, and that goes also for the culture itself. The whole bowing to the emperor, bowing to the court, the looking after the civilization, protecting it, and treating it with respect. Now, that's kind of what you'll find in any kind of search on Google or whatever, and you look up these tiles, you'll find words similar to what I've just said. But of course, we know very well that with every kind of virtue that you can put forward, there's the opposite is also possible. There's the opposite, which is a vice. And so if you can imagine, these dragons can be turned upside down. So if they're reversed, in this case, they'll have opposite meanings to the virtues associated with them. So a red dragon reversed would mean malevolence. It's no longer benevolent, it's malevolent. You have someone that's got this quality, but they've turned it round and using it negatively, they're going to be malevolent. And similarly, the green reversed would mean poverty and insincerity. So the green dragon is going to bring you poverty upside down, and it's insincere in what it says. You can't trust its word. You can't trust what it tells you, what the person personifying that vice is like. And the white dragon, if that's reversed, then you have got corruption and disrespect of tradition. So that's kind of how I'm going to be talking about Mah Jong, or the symbolism that I want to apply from Mah Jong. Only I'm not going to be talking more about China. I'm going to be talking about European civilization, because just as China has its civilization it wants to protect, so it's the same with Europe, and in particular with Christendom. Now, Europeans are just as good as the Chinese at building walls, and this is a section of reconstructed wall of Rome. Rome used to have big walls around it, and so did other cities. There's bits of London Wall you can go and look at even today. There are some towns like Chester, for instance, has got a huge wall that goes all the way around. So there's nothing new in building walls. But the Roman Empire had its own walls as well. The Emperor Hadrian, in particular, he ruled over the Roman Empire from 117 to 138. And he was a consolidator. Prior to him, the Roman Empire had been pushing outwards all the time, trying to get more territory, trying to take over more areas. And it had sort of exhausted itself doing that. And Hadrian recognized that. His boss, the previous emperor, Trajan, had pushed hard into the sort of Danube area and into Romania, and also into the east, going as far as the Tigris River, and capturing area of Mesopotamia. But that was meeting a lot of resistance in the east from Persia, which had controlled that area before. And Hadrian recognized these limits of the empire, and he drew back. He pulled back from some of the conquests they'd made in Europe, and also pulled back from the Euphrates, from the Tigris to the Euphrates, using the river there as the border of a Roman-controlled area, which would include Syria, but leaving out Mesopotamia and beyond. And of course, the northern wall was in Britain, where Hadrian's famous wall was built to separate the Roman province of Britain, Britannia, from the areas north of it in what is now Scotland, which was controlled by the Picts. And the Romans knew that it wasn't worth trying to control the Picts, because the landscape up there, going further north, was very mountainous, and those people were very fierce, and it just wasn't worth the candle. They decided it was much better to build a wall controlling access. So if the Picts wanted to come and do some trade, they could do so, but they would do so at certain places, and they wouldn't be able to nip over the border and do a bit of cattle rustling. So this is kind of what Hadrian's Wall was all about. But it's also, when you build a wall like this, it's also a symbol. It's like my garden fence. It says, this is mine, that's yours. You keep to your side, I'll keep to mine. So that's kind of what Hadrian's Wall was all about. Now, the Roman Empire in the 4th century looked something like this. In 305, a guy called Diocletian, Emperor Diocletian, divided it in two. So you can see the sort of darker purple colour to the left, which includes Britain and France and Spain and a bit of North Africa and Italy. That was all the Western Empire. And then you had the Balkans and Greece and what's now Turkey, Syria, Judea, Egypt. That sort of crescent around the Eastern Mediterranean was the Eastern Empire. And the reason he did this was it was really too much for one man and one capital to control this huge area. It's the biggest empire that the world had seen, certainly in the West, up to that time. So they had then two emperors ruling one empire, and hence the symbol for that was a double-headed eagle, which incidentally was later inherited by Germany as the Holy Roman Empire, and by Russia as well. The name Kaiser comes from Caesar, and Tsar is also from Caesar. So you can see this influence of the Roman Empire stretching right into Russia even, although it wasn't part of the empire as such. Now, in 324 AD, Constantine managed to become sole emperor. He fought a series of battles against rivals. He was first declared emperor of the West in York, and then he marched south and he fought a battle at Milvian Bridge. And he attributed this battle to intercession of the God of the Christians, because he saw the shape of a cross in the sky. And he said, and he got his troops to put the sign of the cross on their shields, and they won the battle. So when he became sole emperor, he declared that Christianity thenceforth was going to be the state religion. And he called a big council of the bishops at Nicaea, and they decided on a creed, an agreed creed for the entire church. So it was a very big deal. And from this time onwards, what we've previously been calling the Roman Empire, we can begin to start calling Christendom. Because really, if you were a Christian, this is where you lived. You lived in Christendom. Now, of course, as we know, later on in the 5th and 6th centuries, barbarians invaded the Roman Empire and took it over, pretty much so. But it didn't destroy them, and it didn't destroy Christendom, because they themselves became Christians. So the net effect of this invasion of these barbarian tribes, mainly from Germany, was to extend Christendom further east and further north. It gradually, over a period of time, went Germany into Poland and up into Scandinavia and the Baltic states and on into Russia. And so Christendom became a much, much larger area as a result of this connection with the previously barbarians who now became Christians. But what I'm going to talk about is something a bit more severe. I know the barbarian invasions were obviously severe at the time, but they haven't really, they didn't destroy Christendom. And we're looking now very much through the perspective of Christianity and Christendom. So I'm going to show you 3 major attacks on Christendom, which I'm going to symbolize by upside down dragon tiles representing the attacks of the 3 dragons, the green, the red and the white, and the impact that those have had on Christendom itself and on the world that we live in today. So I'll just read out to you what I've written here. I want now to return to the symbol of the 3 dragons or arrows, using this as a description of 3 very definite and negative attacks on Christendom that have had lasting consequences. Each of these attacks can be described as Antichrist, in the literal sense of the word, for all 3 have been driven by a denial of the veracity of the Christian message and a desire to eradicate it from consciousness. These dragons have worked tirelessly to destroy Christendom and replace it with their own cultural values. You have to understand that Christendom has its cultural values. These 3 dragons represent 3 alternative cultural values which are at odds with Christendom, at odds with the Christian message, and against Jesus Christ himself, you could say. So let's start with the first dragon, which is the green dragon. And I see this as personifying the attack of Islam on Christianity and on Christendom. Now you might say, well, Islam's a fine religion, a fine upstanding religion. What's your problem, Adrian? Well, I'm looking at it, as I said, from the point of view of Christianity and Christendom. And believe me, Islam has had a bigger impact on Christendom than any other force in history. And the stated intent of Islam is to bring the entire world into subjugation through the worship of its God, Allah, and its prophet, Muhammad. Historically, it has spread its area of control by force or jihad. Muslims are taught that all other religions are false. People who refuse to convert can therefore be enslaved or killed. And that's an important point, because these days we hear that the liberal media is saying, well, we should be treating, Muslims should come to Europe and settle among us. What's wrong with them? They do their worship, we do ours, and, there's no problem. Well, that wasn't how it was originally. And as we see, when planes are flown into Twin Towers, car bombs planted, the London Underground is attacked and blown up, jihad is still alive and well. Might not be a full-scale jihad at the moment, but it is alive and well and still has a lot of force within the Islamic world. Now, while Islam opposes all other religions, it especially dislikes Christianity. It teaches that the Bible is corrupted, that Jesus did not die, that he was just a prophet, and that Christians are guilty for not recognizing that Muhammad was superior to him in every way. So, saying that, I think we can say quite clearly that it is anti-Christ, by definition. How much more anti-Christian do you have to be than that? That more Christians have died at the hands of Islam than any other force in history. And we can see that even as it started, it began in 632, and by 661, it had already, moving from down on the Red Sea in a small area down there, spread up throughout Arabia, conquered Egypt and across a large chunk of North Africa, conquered Syria and Palestine, the Holy Land, up into areas to the east, in the eastern part of Turkey, spreading up to the Caspian Sea, and spreading out through Persia. So even within 30 years, it had conquered a very large empire for itself, and at the expense mostly of Christianity, of Christendom. And thenceforth, if you were a Christian, you could be, and you're living in one of those countries, you could easily be enslaved if you did not convert to Islam. And large numbers of people were enslaved. Their children were taken from them. They were brought up then as Muslims. And the boys were then employed in the army when they became of age to take the battle further. And the girls very often would become concubines or second, third, fourth wives of Islamic warriors. So, this was a huge impact on Christendom and virtually, destroyed Eastern Christianity, at least in those areas. And it got worse. By 861, the Green Dragon had taken over even more Christian lands. It had spread up and seized the rest of North Africa, Spain, the islands of the Mediterranean, and even southern portions of Italy. And it had a devastating effect on Mediterranean trade because most trade was done by ship. It's much cheaper to move things around with a boat than it is to take them on an ox cart. So, this is one of the reasons why the Roman Empire prospered, that they were able to use the Mediterranean as a highway. Well, now large areas of it were totally blocked off, and it was too dangerous to go by ship away from the coasts of Europe. If otherwise, you might easily run into Muslim ships, and they would take your cargo, and they'd take you and any passengers or crew that you had as slaves. So this actually destroyed the economy of southern Europe. And one of the net results was that the center of gravity of Christianity moved further north. It moved up into Germany and France to become the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne. Well, the Spanish managed to get their country back and return to Christendom in 1592, I think it was. But meanwhile, the Turkish Empire, or the Ottoman Empire as we call it, was growing in the east and spreading into the Balkans, spreading up into Greece and Serbia and Bosnia and Montenegro, Croatia, pushing up into Romania and up into the borders of Hungary. And it reached its peak when, at the siege of Vienna, when the Viennese held out and defeated the Turkish army. They didn't try again after that. but it's still a mighty empire and very much feared in Europe at the time. Well, here we can see a map today of countries which are Islamic in majority rule, or majority of the people. Obviously, all of North Africa, Arabia, Turkey, going eastwards into Iran, up into the stands, Turkestan and Afghanistan and the other stand countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and out into Indonesia and even a little bit of the Philippines. So massive, well, it's not an empire anymore, but a massive area of control of the Islamic world as opposed to Christendom. So this is a lasting impact of Islam. And I'm not here speaking, as I said, I'm looking at Islam and the other things I'm going to talk about from the impact they've had on Christianity and on Christendom. And those areas in the East and on Africa that were Christian are no longer. Turkey, at one time, was the center of Eastern Christianity. There were great schools and in Constantinople and Antioch and Edessa. These were mighty centers of Christianity. Hardly any Christians there at all now, driven out or converted at the end of a sword. So now I want to look at the red dragon, and the red dragon symbolizes communism and the impact of communism and what that's had. Obviously, this is a much more recent phenomenon than Islam, but it has had a huge impact in its day. So it began, it's an ideology rather than a religion. Doesn't believe in religion, doesn't believe in God. It glorifies the leader of the communist nation. Actually, in many ways, he is like a god, a Stalin figure, a Pol Pot, a Mao Zedong. These figures become like gods. And in fact, it's very curious that they like to be mummified after death, so people can carry on going and seeing this horrible waxy corpse and still feeling fear for this dead body that might come alive again, I suppose. Anyway, historically it's persecuted Christians and sought to eradicate all religious belief. So in 1917, the Russian Empire, whose people had rebelled against the Tsar, were taken over by the communists. Communists renamed the country the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and a new tyranny began. So, if the people had thought they had it bad under the Tsar, it got much worse once the communists took over. And Stalin, was an absolute monster, probably one of the biggest monsters ever lived. Property was nationalized and people were forced to work on collective farms and factories. It's estimated that as many as 30 million people died in the famines resulting from these policies. 30 million people. That's far more than the combined totals of the two world wars that died just because some idiot thought he knew better about how farming should be done collectively or how factories should be run, and caused enormous stress and poverty to the nation. Now, prior to the communist takeover, Russia was a Christian country. Christians were now increasingly persecuted by the state. Atheism was the new orthodoxy. So you can see this huge empire that developed as the Soviet Union, stretching down into the Stan areas, as I was talking about earlier, going all the way out east, Kamchatka Peninsula, right in the Far East, down there opposite Japan, in Manchuria, and going eastwards into Europe. And here we can see at the end of the Second World War, the Iron Curtain came down, separating Eastern Europe from Western Europe, and leaving countries like Poland and East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, captives within the Eastern Bloc. These were Christian countries, but Christianity was very much put under pressure. People were still able to be Christians, but it cost them a lot. They would not get promotion. They were being spied on. They were under pressure. And the churches were very much under the control of the state. So that's the impact of the Russian Revolution. But that wasn't the only one, of course, was it? We then had the Chinese Revolution in 1949. During the Second World War, China was occupied by the Japanese, and the Japanese behaved absolutely brutally in China. There was very great enmity between China and Japan even to this day. But after the war, when the Japanese were defeated, the Russians rushed into Manchuria at the very end of the war and grabbed it before the Allies could do anything about it. But in China itself, there were two movements. One was communism, and the other was nationalism, the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek. And these two groups fought it out, but eventually the nationalists were driven out, and they retreated to the island of Formosa, which is now called Taiwan. And for a long time, the rest of the world regarded Taiwan or Formosa as being the real China. That China, the mainland, the huge country of China, was a pariah state. Well, of course, that changed eventually, I think at the time of Nixon, President Nixon, when America recognized China. So China now became communist and has remained so ever since. Christians were persecuted and many others, many were murdered. But I should say, that they didn't only persecute the Christians. Buddhism was also put under pressure, and in due course, in the 1950, the Chinese invaded Tibet and persecuted the Buddhist monks there. Many of them killed, and the monasteries destroyed and vandalized. The sacred texts put as to be used in urinals and this kind of thing. So communism is not a religion; it's a philosophy and an ideology, but it's anti-Christ and anti any ideas about any kind of God. Well, then in the great leap forward of Chairman Mao, that led to the deaths of tens of millions of Chinese through famine. They hadn't learnt from the Russians. Millions more died in the Cultural Revolution, which was disastrous economically and culturally. I remember the Cultural Revolution. I remember watching on television aghast that these were kind of the young people. They were the equivalent of millennials today, the young people. And they gathered in probably 1 million or more in Tiananmen Square, all waving the little red book with the thoughts of Chairman Mao. And they went off into the cities and the small towns looking for dissidents and anyone who was considered old-fashioned, clinging on to the old ideas of Confucianism or Western ideas about music and the arts. And these people were paraded through the streets with dunces' hats. They were sent out into the fields to go and work with their hands, do a real job of work instead of being a classical pianist or whatever. And it absolutely destroyed the culture of China. It was an absolute disaster for China, which it hasn't fully recovered from, probably never will. And I think you'll probably find more Chinese artifacts, ancient artifacts, in the British Museum than you will probably in any museum in China, because what was there was looted and destroyed. It's lucky that certain things were taken out and were protected. Anyway, China was not alone. Korea Again, at the end of the war, the Russians invaded Korea and turned North Korea into a communist state. They wanted to move into South Korea, but that was resisted. The Americans came in, and the Korean War was fought, and eventually an armistice was reached, which is still in force today. So North Korea is actually the most pure form of communist state that still exists, with a leader who's all-powerful and everyone's terrified of, a huge army, everything under central control, military control, people treated like dirt and worked to death. And if anyone tries to escape and they get caught, God help them. So that's still going on in Korea. And that's kind of how it was in China and Russia, but, before recent times. And then there's Vietnam. Vietnam, again, the same thing happened after the end of the Second World War. The Vietnamese wanted their independence from France. The French thought they were going to come back and take over their old colonies, but the Vietnamese weren't having it. And after they defeated the French, Dien Bien Phu, the Americans came in to bolster up South Vietnam. This whole domino theory was still in play at the time, that Asia was, as one domino fell, it would bring about the fall of another. And before you knew it, they'd have communists in America. So they fought in the Vietnamese War, which America lost. They were forced to withdraw. And South Vietnam very quickly was taken over by the North, and that became communist too. So Vietnam is still a communist country. It has opened up somewhat, but it's still controlled by the communists. Oops. So at its largest spread, the Red Dragon territories of communism included all these areas that you can see on this map. This map here in red. Nearly all of Asia, including India, you can see there, was communist for a time. Bits of the Middle East, like Syria and Iraq, were communist. Northern Africa, big chunks of that were communist. Into Eastern Africa, and Madagascar and Mozambique. And of course Cuba out in the West. So it was a big spread. And the Cold War was a real thing. I think it's probably hard for young people today to realize just how frightened we were in the West of being overrun with Russian tanks pouring into Europe, into Western Europe. And NATO had a real job at the time to hold back this Russian horde of communists that really did want to invade Western Europe and take over and spread the ideology of communism, which they believed in, totally. It all went bad for the communists in 1989, when basically the East, or the communist empire, could not match the West for prosperity and development or armament. And when places like Poland rose in rebellion and started having candlelit marches, and Hungary demanding their freedom to go to the West, it all came tumbling down. East Germany also rose and demanded unification with West Germany, and the wall came down. And you had the reunification of Germany. Russia was forced to, or the Soviet Union collapsed, and parts of Russia itself seceded from the Soviet Empire. And Russia became a much smaller state than it was previously. So this was a very real event. Even Russia now is not communist, although there are still many of the trappings of communism, and some would say that Putin behaves like a communist. I don't think he does really, but you can see what a fearful empire it was. The actual countries which still are openly communist, you can see the red areas here of China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. It's pretty much gone from everywhere else, but it forms an undercurrent, and it still has a lot of leverage, though it doesn't call itself communism, it calls itself socialism. And you'll find socialism, the far left have moved under the umbrella of socialism to take over many of the moderate left-wing parties throughout Europe. And this too has had a major impact on the way things have developed in the West. Now I'm going to come to the White Dragon. Now the empire of the White Dragon is the most recent, but is much less easy to see than the other two dragons. Indeed, it is invisible to the naked eye, as it has no visible flag, but operates through subsidiaries. Its defining philosophy is Globalism, which, loosely interpreted, means a world without borders. Its goal, as with the red and green dragons, is to bring about a one-world government, but in its own image, and not theirs. And I should stress again that, as you will see, this globalist White Dragon empire is anti-Christian, and we'll develop that theme. A favourite phrase used by followers of the White Dragon is common purpose. Exactly what purpose they hold in common is not explained to those outside the movement, but it boils down to this: make all countries the same by mixing their populations. This is why they advocate open borders. 2. Govern the world through elite hierarchies operating under the guise of non-elected bodies such as charities and quangos. 3. Establish supranational law courts to rule in favour of the objectives of the White Dragon elite. I'll just stop there. Just think about this. Each country traditionally has had its own legal system and laws, law code. We're very proud of ours in Britain. But the elite, these White Dragon elite, one of their objectives is to set up courts of law which are above all nations and can dictate to them and overturn the laws and rulings of their own countries, their own countrymen. And you might say, well, that's right, human rights and all of that. Well, who's determining what is a human right? Who is determining what is the law and what is to be the law? It's done in secret. It's done by people behind closed doors. And they put together law courts and then seek to enforce their rulings on other people without any kind of recourse or reply from the population so affected. Anyway, maintain complete control over the money system so that dissidents dare not speak out for fear of being left penniless. Well, that's another one, We have central banks, the Federal Reserve in America, the Bank of England in England, the European Bank, and so on. But these are private institutions. They're not national institutions. They're run by elites who are very wealthy people, and they have the right to, or they take the right to expand money. That they don't hold gold to cover the amount of money they say they have. They just print more of it to lend at rates of interest. That's how they increase their wealth, and they gradually take control of the entire wealth of the planet. And this has been happening for a long time, a couple of 100 years. De-establish religions, especially Christianity, by disseminating contradictory ideas, and especially by treating all religions as interchangeable. So as far as these elites are concerned, as far as the globalists, the White Dragon, they could care less about Christendom or Christianity. Most of them are not believers anyway, they're atheists. They follow the logic of Darwin, that we arose out of the slime of the earth, and as gradually things just developed to become me. They don't see any hand of God in any of this, but they're willing to tolerate religions as long as they're all treated equally. So that's why they welcome Islam into Europe, for instance, because why should they be discriminated against? Buddhism, just as good as Christianity. Taoism, any kind of paganism you like. You can go and worship in stone circles and sacrifice pigeons to the moon or something. This is all okay because it's your human right to do as you like. And then encourage materialism and vice. So that's another aspect of this White Dragon. It works through things like Hollywood, gradually feeding images into the public consciousness of incredible violence, total sexual promiscuity, things which our parents or my parents would have been absolutely shocked by and would not have been tolerated. I mean, I can remember the trial over Lady Chatterley's lover. That was a famous book by D.H. Lawrence about an aristocratic lady who starts an affair with her gardener. And it's very pornographic in its descriptions. Today, that would be regarded as nothing at all. It's just life. And you see worse on television constantly. So there's this gradual coarsening of the culture and the reversing from the desire for virtue to the desire for vice. And think of the whole Gorgon Gecko, Greed is Good in Wall Street, famous film of Wall Street. Greed is good. Well, greed was always taught as being bad before, but they've managed to reverse it so that now the most idolized people are people who make loads and loads of money, not because they need it, but because greed is good. If you got, there's never enough. You can always have more. This is the subtle influence of the White Dragon. As can be seen from the above, the White Dragon is rather more intelligent in its approach than the red or green. Instead of seeking to breach the walls of Christian culture by attacking it with an army, it works by subterfuge. A major weapon in this is immigration, especially into Europe and America from the Third World. In this way it destabilizes countries, as the new arrivals have no interest in preserving traditions not their own. This is why there is an immigration crisis throughout Europe now. Now, they don't tell you this on BBC or any other news network, that this whole impact of this immigration, this world without borders, is completely impractical and it's actually against the preservation of culture. Because to have a culture, you have to have limits. Because a culture requires that there's a space which is that culture's space. Take away that and it just dissolves. It's like every cell in your body has got a membrane around it that separates that cell from every other cell. You just make it open, that everything just wanders around, then it's no longer a culture. So, now I want us to look now at the European Union. Interestingly, this building that they built in Strasbourg for the Parliament, it looks unfinished when you look at it. And you think, well, why have they left it like that? Why is it this truncated tower with only half built? And it's because it's meant to represent the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel you read about in the Bible. Babylon, Babel supposedly was a sort of world capital where all the tribes of mankind got together. They all spoke the same language at the time. And so they set together to build a great tower which would take them up to heaven so they could get up to where God was and invade heaven under their own steam. Now, of course, we're talking symbolism here, aren't we? But God didn't like that and destroyed the tower and made it so that they wouldn't understand each other anymore, divided up all the languages. So thenceforward, the whole world couldn't speak to itself because everybody's speaking different languages. Well, one of the aims, I suppose, of the European Union is to rebuild this unity of language, which is a bit odd since they've got hundreds of translators translating everything into all the languages of Europe. Much to their chagrin, when they actually want to talk to each other, they tend to use English, although they hate us and hate the Americans. But unfortunately for them, English is the lingua franca of the world. It's the language that most people know as their second language, and quite a lot as their first. So the European Union is the most complete of a series of projects designed to force nations together into regional blocs. Its purpose is to strip away democracy from constituent nations and make them vassal states ruled by an unelected elite of White Dragon initiates. And this is the European Parliament building in Strasbourg. It's intended to look like the Tower of Babel. In the Bible, this was an unfinished project to build a tower reaching to heaven. The EU wishes to complete the job and symbolically challenges God himself by bringing to fruition a one-world state. Yeah, they want to turn... The whole idea of the European Union is to make a United States of Europe. It's actually not looking so promising for it at the moment. We've had our Brexit vote in England, and increasingly other countries in Europe are also starting to rebel and starting to say, hey, just a minute, what do you think you're doing? We're not going to open our borders to let in everyone that you want us to take. And the people are starting to challenge the authority of this paper tiger, the European Union, which has done a huge amount to damage European culture and Christian civilization, Christendom. But the EU is not alone. There was something called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association. And this was intended to be the North American equivalent of the EU. Not so much had to be done there. They wanted to unite the United States with Canada and Mexico to make one big country, one big bloc, which again would be run by an unelected elite with control over the laws. I mean, can you imagine this? Can you imagine this idea that America gives up its constitution, gives up its declaration and its Bill of Rights to some body, some higher law courts that are going to rule on things and tell the Americans what to do and how they're meant to do it, and that there'll be free movement of people and traffic throughout, from Mexico particularly, to move up into the United States or Canada and vice versa. I mean, who thinks up these things? Well, people at the White Dragon do. But this was not the end of the story. There's also the Latin American Free Trade Association. All the Latin American countries being brought together. And again, this would be a preliminary free trade association leading on to a Latin American Union, where all the countries in Latin America would become one. Again, who thinks of these things? They can hardly govern themselves as it is. Constant revolutions and wars and crises and, going bust and so on throughout Latin America. Do they really imagine that throughout that whole continent you could have a central authority, that they could run all those? You really imagine that in that country, that huge country of South America, they could have one authority running all those subsidiary countries? I think they can't even... can you imagine trying to run Brazil and Argentina just on their own without Chile and Paraguay and Uruguay and Venezuela and all the rest? Well, crazy, but this is what they're aiming for. And then the African Union. Yes, this actually exists. African Union. You're going to have ever closer union, make one big country of Africa. Well, again, if the state of Africa is anything to go by, how on earth they think they can organize things better from a central authority than as it is now, I have no idea. It's not going to work. It's crazy, but this is what they're trying to do. And then there's an association of Southeast Asian nations. And I think nearly all of the countries of Southeast Asia in there, they're hoping to get Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and China to join. I suppose that bundle of sticks in the middle, the fasces, that's the symbol of the fasces, actually. I wonder if anyone's told them that. Joining all those sticks together like that in a bundle, that's the symbol of fascism, which is actually not so far from the truth. So, they get all these different parts of the world organized into different blocks: the European Union, North American Union, South American Union, African Union, Southeast Asian Union. And then what they have in mind is this. All of these are ruled over by the White Dragon. These regional blocks are intended to be the dominions of the White Dragon elite. They'll control the world while everyone else will be reduced to serfdom. Yeah, well, how could it be otherwise? Everybody else is left bankrupt, broke. The elite have all the money, they have all the ownership of the lands, and they control everything through these blocks. This is the plan, and it's pretty near completion. Frightening, isn't it? And then we have to ask ourselves, well, who are this global elite? The dragons report to an even higher global elite. All three dragons, yeah, the green, the red, and the white, they all report to the same global elite, which by controlling international finance runs the world. It is an evil cabal that regards people and nations as its slaves, and that's increasingly so. They want to organize the world so that production and is done for dirt cheap labor in the East Asian areas, China and Vietnam and places like that. Global finance, the financial centers are Zurich and London, New York in the West. And places like Africa, South America are used as places for quarrying minerals and taking down forests and trees and just basically robbing. What happens to the people? They don't care. They can starve. And in fact, they're kept in a permanent state of starvation and despondency. So that's kind of what the global agenda is. But then you have to ask, who does the global elite report to, or what is their cover? Well, you can see it here. The United Nations. I mean, talk about globalism. The symbol of the United Nations is a globe. And yes, of course, it's the idea after the Second World War was we want peace. We're going to bring peace to the world. And nations to discuss with each other. And we'll gradually make it so that there'll be one world with one world peace. And it sounds wonderful, doesn't it? But that's not what it's really all about, as you'll see. The UN itself is organized with 6 principal organs. There's a General Assembly, so you have members from all the different countries can sit in the General Assembly. There's a Security Council. I think that number's 15. And 5 of those members, I think it's 5, are permanent members, and they're the nations the big nations with the money that have been paying for it, and who have, and the other qualification is have nuclear weapons. There's America, USA, that is, Russia, France, Britain, and I think China's in it now as well. So they're permanent members, and the other seats are taken in turn by other member nations for 6 months at a time. So that's the Security Council. Then there's the Economic and Social Council. Okay. There's a Trusteeship Council. Now that one's been inactive, but who knows what the Trusteeship Council's all about? And trustees for what? International Court of Justice. Oh, there you have it. International. Stands above the nations. Never mind your own national court. You person can make an appeal to the international court and have whatever ruling that was deemed under your court overturned. And then there's the UN Secretariat. And you see these secretary generals that run around the world, and every time there's a war breaks out, they're the ones that start asking for money so it can be policed and stopped. Now, they also have 17 agencies, and these cover everything from agriculture to aviation to tourism and education, and these are just a few of them. First of all, there's UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. In other words, they can influence the development of your culture, determine what's taught in your schools, and make sure that what's being done is politically correct. And then there's the International Monetary Fund. Okay, we'll lend you money. We've got a fund, we can lend you money. Yeah, but at interest, and countries find themselves put into debt, which they can never get out of. And once they're in that situation, like Greece is today, for instance, then they lose control of their politics as well. Lose control of who sits as their president and then in their government. And then there's the World Health Organization. Well, I think we all agree that there are certain matters about diseases that do have to be tackled at a world level, but should the United Nations be in charge of that? I don't think so. I think we've got bodies like the Red Cross that do a good job in that area. And the World Bank, of course, which ties in with the International Monetary Fund. Now, the United Nations headquarters is in New York, and you've probably seen this building on television pictures. You may have seen it yourself if you've been to New York. But it's got its own surprising little secret. There's a curious chapel, which they call a quiet room for meditation inside this building. Now, why would they have a quiet room inside the building? And there it is. It was, when this building was being built, the Secretary General then was a guy called U Thant. No, it wasn't U Thant. It was Dag Hammarskjöld. Dag Hammarskjöld was the second. U Thant came after him. Dag Hammarskjöld reckoned that they needed a place where people could go and sit quietly, away from the hubbub, so they could think. And he was into meditation and a lot of other things, I think. He was a bit of a proto-hippie in a way, a bit of a mystic. And this curious block is made of magnetite, and I'm told, I haven't examined it myself, but I'm told it goes deep underground, underneath this chapel, linking with the rocks of the earth underneath. So there's the idea, I suppose, of a kind of magnetic link with the earth itself. Well, who knows? And then there's this strange cubist-looking drawing at the end, which is not, they're not allowed to have any religious symbolism in there at all because it might be offensive to people of other religions. So there's no Christian crosses, no crescents, no Aum signs, no Stars of David, nothing like that in there. So at first sight you think, well, yes, yeah, why not have a quiet room where people can go and sit and meditate and think? Why not? Well, I'm suspicious, and you should be too when you hear the next bit. Now, that room was designed and built under the auspices of something called the Lucis Trust, which is linked to the UN as an advisory body. And it's an organization that was originally founded by an American lady called Alice Bailey. She had previously been a theosophist, and I'm going to explain what that title means shortly, but split off to form her own movement. Her main activity was in writing and publishing books on all manner of occult subjects. And these are kept in print by the Lucis Trust. And it has its offices in a tower block on United Nations Plaza, close to the UN building itself. And the Lucis Trust still exists, and it's still run, and it still runs that meditation room that you saw, and is responsible for it. So you need to ask yourself, well, who exactly was this Alice Bailey, and what is this Lucis Trust all about? Well, Lucis Press was originally called Lucifer Publishing. Wow, there's an eye-opener. The name was changed because it offended Christians. However, it was no accident. Bailey regarded Lucifer as the real saviour of mankind. You can read this in her books. She believed that the so-called fallen angels were really high-level beings who had descended to the earth from the sun. This, she said, was a big sacrifice for them to make. They did it to bring illumination and wisdom to mankind in defiance of God. And she got these strange ideas from Theosophy, a movement founded by H.P. Blavatsky. So that's why you're Theosophist. The Theosophical Society still exists. It's got places all over the world. There's a big centre in London. There's another one in LA, and I think there's others in New York. And its main headquarters are at a place called Adia in India. So we need to now think about these influences. Where did Alice Bailey get these ideas, and what did Madame Blavatsky have to do with it? Well, Madame Blavatsky, or HPB, was a Russian lady who came to the West. She claimed to have visited Tibet and to have been instructed in occult matters by masters of wisdom. She certainly had psychic powers and could manifest objects such as letters from her masters. Much of this material was dictated to her partner, Henry Olcott. I'll just stop there a minute. Madame Blavatsky undoubtedly had occult powers. She was a magician, and she could materialize objects or letters. She would get letters from her masters that would just appear. Or there's one famous event that's recorded where she was in some kind of carriage with some friends or people that were finding out about Theosophy. And they wanted her to show, give them a message. And she said, oh, okay. So she made a message appear inside a cushion. They had to cut open the cushion, which had never been opened before. And sure enough, inside was a piece of paper with a message on it. And actually, that message, I'm told, is in the British Library now. You could actually go and have a look at it. I can't remember what it said. Anyway, she claimed that the masters, and there were several of them, would appear to her, and she had actually met them in person. That they were living people. They weren't just spirits. They were living people living in Tibet. And she had been to their monastery, a place called Shigatse, I think. And there they had instructed her and taught her their wisdom. And then she'd come back to the West, but they could still appear to her in physical form. On at least one occasion, one or more of them came and saw her in his physical body, came to London to meet with her there. So she had these masters, and her books, she wrote a number of books, but two major pairs, 2 volumes sets, one called Isis Unveiled and the other called The Secret Doctrine. Now, if you've ever looked at these books, they're incredibly complicated, very difficult to read, because they go backwards and forwards over ideas and jump around. But you look at these books and you think, well, how on earth did this woman write these books in such a short time? Without recourse to going to the British Library or the American equivalent, without being able to research. There wasn't so much written about Eastern religions in those days. She was writing in the 1880s. And you think, well, how on earth did she do it? Well, she tells us that the texts would appear to her, her masters would materialize them in front of her, she could see them, and she would read it and dictate it to her colleague, Colonel M. Alcock, who would write things down. So that way she received these books clairvoyantly. And they are, I have to admit, they're quite extraordinary works. But they're not exactly Christian. She called what she taught Buddhism, spelt with one D, not two, but actually it was occultism with an Indian flavour. It really had nothing much to do with what we would understand as Buddhism today, or any Buddhist would understand as Buddhism. And she herself detested Christianity, and especially the Catholic Church. I'm going to show you what she had to say on that subject. And we get a taste of Blavatsky's contempt for Christianity here in this passage from another book, from Isis Unveiled. The present volume, Isis Unveiled, has been written to small purpose if they have not shown, 1, that Jesus, the Christ God, is a myth, concocted 2 centuries after the real Hebrew Jesus died. 2, that therefore he never had any authority to give Peter or anyone else plenary power. 3, that even if he had given such authority, the word Petra, rock, referred to the revealed truths of the Petroma, not to him who thrice denied him, and that besides, the apostolic succession is a gross and palpable fraud. You should understand here that within the Catholic, this is an attack on the Catholic Church, that Catholics believe that that Jesus gave the keys to the gates of heaven to Peter, and said, to whom you let in, who you don't let in, they don't get in. And that the popes thereafter, Peter went to Rome when he was martyred, but he was the bishop there, and the popes then continued to say that they have inherited the authority of Peter as Bishop of Rome. That's why they claim to be head of the whole Christian church. You might dispute that, but she certainly doesn't like that idea. Anyway, carrying on. 4, that the gospel according to Matthew is a fabrication based upon a wholly different manuscript. The whole thing, therefore, is an imposition alike upon priest and penitent. So Matthew was one of Jesus' apostles, so you would think he kind of knew what he was talking about when he's describing what happened. Yes, very likely the present version that we have has been added to or changed, been copied many times, but we've no reason to think that it doesn't go back to what Matthew himself actually taught. And similarly with the Gospel of St. John, who was the youngest of the apostles. She doesn't mention John, but John was the youngest of the apostles, lived well into his 80s, and he wrote not just the Gospel, but a couple of epistles and the book of Revelation. So there's a lot of stuff in there, but you can see that she's definitely anti-Christian and anti-church. Now, let's just go over and see here. Yeah, now, the second set of books that she wrote was called The Secret Doctrine, and that's the main one where she was seeing these things and having it dictated to her. And she writes here, esoteric philosophy admits neither good nor evil per se as existing independently in nature. The cause for both is found, as regards the cosmos, in the necessity of contraries or contrasts, and with respect to man, in his human nature, his ignorance and passions. There is no devil, or the utterly depraved, as there are no angels absolutely perfect, though there may be spirits of light and darkness. Thus Lucifer, the spirit of intellectual enlightenment and freedom of thought, is metaphorically the guiding beacon which helps man to find his way through the rocks and sandbanks of life. For Lucifer is the Logos in his highest, and the adversary in his lowest aspect, both of which are reflected in our ego. Now, this takes a little bit of explanation. This obviously is total heresy as far as Christianity is concerned. First of all, the idea that there's no such thing as evil, good and evil, they're just relative terms. And in terms of man, just refer to his passions. A contrast of those, ignorance and passions. Well, that's not what's taught in Christianity or in any religion. The ideal of Christianity is that there is the good and there is the evil, and man struggles between them to reach upwards, to become good enough to get off this planet, to get back to God. That's the whole idea of it. They're not just relative terms. And the idea that that Lucifer is this angel of light, and she actually calls him the Logos, and within any kind of Greek philosophy or church philosophy, the Logos is understood as being the Word of God. And the reason for that is quite simple. If you read the beginning of the book of Genesis with the creation story, and God says, "Let there be light." In Latin, that is fiat lux. Let there be light. Well, God is creating by using words. He speaks it, and then it happens. God gives commands. The Logos is the command. That's why Logos also means law. Law is a commandment. So the commands must be obeyed. And the equivalent of a king gives a command, "Go and build me Hadrian's wall." Or Hadrian says that. And sure enough, then the legions go out and they build a wall. The guy in charge doesn't have to go and do the building himself, but he's the one that takes the decision. He's the one with the will and expresses the will in words, says, "Go and do this," or "Let there be light, let there be a sun and an earth and a moon." This is the understanding of the Logos. But there's also a secondary understanding within Christianity, and that Jesus is the incarnation of the Logos. So here we have her saying that the devil is the Logos, that Lucifer, or she said there's no such thing as a devil, there's no such thing as spirits of darkness. Well, she's claiming that he's actually a spirit of light, and that is turning everything upside down. So you can begin to see that having a chapel within the UN building really doesn't fit this. Now, I've got a bit more here I'm going to write here. I'll tell you here. We see from this passage a dismissal of good and evil as objective realities. Everything is to be understood as relative. In other words, there can be no sin and therefore no judgment. The denial of the existence of a devil, all beings are a mixture of good and bad, though some are of light and some of darkness. Lucifer, being the light bearer, is the guiding beacon for man. He is the patron of intellectual enlightenment and freedom of thought. Lucifer, not Christ as is taught in the Bible, is therefore the Logos, i.e. the carrier of the Word of God. He is also, in his lower aspect, the adversary, i.e. the equivalent of the planet Saturn in astrology, who challenges us so that we may gain strength. Well, this is upside-down thinking, but very typical of White Dragon. This is how the White Dragon works. It twists things round. And the thing about real evil, and the thing about the devil, yes, there is a spirit called the devil, or a spirit called Lucifer, as he's a liar. First and foremost, he's a liar. And this is the whole thing about the Faustian Pact, that he tricks you into doing what he wants you to do. And the best way to do that is not to oppose directly, but to tell half-truths, to create a fabulous secret doctrine out of nothing, which captivates the imagination, and you think, yeah, well, this must be the real thing because it's so complicated. It must be ancient wisdom. Wow, Madame Blavatsky's really found it, and she's brought it back, and yeah, we go with this. Great, Well, that can take you in the wrong direction. So it's clear that Madame Blavatsky's philosophy is profoundly heretical and totally at odds with Christianity. Underneath an elaborate facade of complicated esotericism and references to imaginary world history, it is Luciferianism pure and simple. The difference is stark. Luciferianism teaches that the way to enlightenment is following the guidance of Lucifer, so that one can become as wise and omniscient as him, if not God himself. Christianity teaches that far from following Lucifer, man's fall into matter is a delusion that needs to be escaped from. Salvation is possible if one can reconnect to God through Jesus Christ. This will lead out of the labyrinth that is the material world, back to the higher world of spirit from which we came. So you have to ask yourself then, why is there a Luciferian silent room inside the headquarters of the UN? It rather suggests that that is the religion that underpins the UN. After all, why would they have a chapel to something else? And my guess is that the elite who run the UN report directly to their master, who Jesus called the Prince of this world, whose number is 666. And he thinks he's going to continue to rule forever. This is the spirit that Jesus himself called the Prince of this world. And he wants a one-world government run according to his wishes, with mankind as slaves. The elite might think that they aren't slaves, but they are too. We're all slaves on this planet. We're trying to get off it. We're trying to get back up to heaven, which is where our souls come from originally, if you believe Christianity. And many other religions too, by the way. So, having done away with nations and even the regional unions and dragons, the plan is for the beast to rule the world through the elite as overseers of the United Nations in Geneva. And this may explain why a mock human sacrifice was carried out at CERN in 2016. CERN is where the laboratory where they have the Hadron Collider, where they're looking for the God particle, the colliding matter. It's absolute nonsense. It's nothing to do with that, in fact. But they had a Luciferic pagan ritual outside that place. And they had a big statue of the god Shiva outside it. It seems to be connected. It's only 30 miles from Geneva. And there are close connections between it and what's going on at the UN. It also explains why there are rumours of a connection between the elite and satanic rituals like paedophilia and even child sacrifice. Now, I'm not going to go into that. It's really horrific idea, and I know if you go on YouTube and on the internet, you'll find a lot about this, and I'm not going to go into it. But let's just say I wouldn't put it past them. So I'm going to say no more about Luciferianism except to mention that it is at the root of most of what calls itself occultism. Genuine esoteric philosophy teaches humility and a willingness to reconnect with God and not to puff up in pride like Lucifer. And if you'd like to learn more, then watch my YouTube video series, which is called No Sympathy for the Devil. Now, I've gone into this whole subject of Luciferianism somewhat there and why it should be avoided. Meanwhile, real initiates await the return of Jesus as prophesied in the Bible, both in the Old and the New Testaments. And I'm planning to do quite a few videos on that subject as well. I've studied the Bible quite a lot and found certain ideas and connections in the book of Revelation, particularly reinterpreting those symbols and signs. And also, you know, if you haven't received a serious Christian education, and most people probably in the West haven't these days, you probably won't be aware that there are many prophecies in the Old Testament written hundreds of years before the birth of Jesus that prophesy his coming and prophesy the events in his life, or at least the crucifixion, and the resurrection. So, you know, there is plenty to study esoterically, and this is what I mean by esotericism, is studying the inner teachings of real religion. You don't need occultism. You don't need special powers. You don't need to go around puffed up saying, I'm a healer, or, you know, I'm a magician. You know, we don't need to be like Dynamo or any other street magician. We certainly don't want to be worshipping Lucifer or any demons. You don't need to be talking with demons to find out the future. All of that, leave that behind. If you've dabbled with it, I've dabbled with some of that before. You don't need it. Keep away from it. What you really need is to study the texts, use your own logic, and find out what symbols mean, and prepare yourself. Because believe me, we are living in the end times, and I have no doubt about that at all. We don't know exactly when Jesus is going to reappear, but he's coming back, and it's not going to be very long. So it's time for us to prepare for that, and not to get suckered into White Dragon Luciferianism or the cult of the elites. And thank goodness that Britain has voted against staying in the EU. I just hope that the Luciferians in our own government don't get away with trying to keep us in it without it being said so specifically. That's still up in the air at the moment. So thank you for your patience and for listening. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and as you could see, there's this whole idea of using the Chinese dragons to explain what's gone on with Christendom is not as daft as it might at first appear. Thank you very much.